Okay, so we'll jump straight into the learning materials for today. As usual, I've got stuff up on the blog. So we've looked at 3 weeks ago. We had a look at Yahoo pipes and how we can use that to create mashups of data from different sources across the web, and then use that data and display it. And the main cool thing about that was that it was in real time. Every time we access the pipe, it grabs the data and it's live and it's up to date. And then the week after, we looked at a little bit of an introduction to JavaScript and how we can use that to dynamically manipulate data and then also manipulate the web page itself, the document object model. And so today I want to have a look at combining two of those things. So what I've got is a mashup example that essentially takes the top selling songs off iTunes, and then using those it goes and finds on YouTube the music video, and then as well on a lyrics site it goes and finds the lyrics for those songs. So I've got this example all detailed with links to the example, what the pipe looks like, and the example code. And then right down the bottom here, I've also got a link where you can download the completed source code if you want to have a look at that while I'm demonstrating. But I'll just show you what it looks like first of all. Okay, so it looks something like this. Let me just check one thing. Okay, now it's, for whatever reason, it's slightly temperamental with either showing or not showing the YouTube video, and that's really just a problem with the pipe itself being temperamental, but hopefully we'll see if we can get that actually working. But essentially what you've got here is this section here is information pulled from iTunes. When it works, there'll be a YouTube video here, and then a section here where it also pulls in the lyrics for the particular songs from a lyrics website. Now it also has up the top here a drop-down menu, so we can select different categories of different genres of music, and it will load the data again. Okay, there we go. The YouTube videos worked on this one. Okay, so that's what it should look like. And so you'll notice actually when I do this that, see what's big in children's music. You'll notice that when I do this, what it's doing is it's refreshing the data on the page without actually reloading the page. Okay, so that's a benefit of using Ajax, which is what we're going to use to access the data and inject it into the page. So Ajax is really a technology that is designed exactly for that. It allows you to make calls to a server and get data and update the page without actually having to refresh the page itself. And you'll notice that a lot on websites that have a lot of updated content. If, for example, you make a post on Facebook, okay, it'll show up without actually reloading the page in order to update the content to the page. Alright, so let's have a look at, let me just see if this works first. Okay, there we go, it's working now. Alright, so let's first have a look at the pipe. Now I'm not going to go through the pipe in a huge amount of detail because we've sort of done that. I'm more interested in just assuming that we've got a working pipe and then showing you how you pull the data out of that pipe and put it into the web page using JavaScript. But anyway, I've got a link to the pipe off the blog post here. What am I doing here? Sorry, just have to log in. Try that again. And again. Okay, there we go. So this is what the pipe looks like. So one thing that I don't think that we covered when we looked at pipes initially was user input, or we may have, I can't remember. But anyway, this one takes a user input, and I'll show you how you can send data to the pipe for it to be used in there. So in our example, whenever I'm selecting one of these menu items, it's actually sending a bit of information to represent that particular genre to the pipe, which gets inserted in to this input here. And I'll show you how that's done in the code. And then essentially what it does is it goes and fetches an RSS feed from the Apple website. And I've documented in the final code exactly where that comes from. I've got a comment down here. So itunes.apple.com/RSS. Okay, so this is how I found my original data source. So you can generate an RSS feed here to look for top albums, or in my case I had top songs, and then in particular genres. So when I generate that, you'll notice that it creates a URL down here for me, which is the URL to an RSS feed, which will get me those top 10 songs. So if I was to paste that into a browser, okay, I'd get this XML stream, which is that RSS feed. So this is the sort of thing that I'm using in my pipe here, where I'm building this here. You can see the start of that URL there. And the other part is if I actually specify a genre, you'll notice that, okay, it appends a little bit more to the URL here where it says genre equals and then a number. Okay, so they have different numbers that represent different genres. So that's why in my pipe, okay, this is actually a number input rather than a text input. So all I've really done in my example here is to generate this drop-down menu. All I've done is really just taken this drop-down menu here, and I've simply just copied the code from the web page. So I've copied that as the HTML, and it has all of the drop-down options, and you notice that the values of all the drop-down options here represent the number that is the genre, that is the ID of those particular genres. So by copying that drop-down menu, and then when I select it, sending the ID for that genre to the pipe, then it knows a particular RSS feed to go and look for. Okay, so it does that, it fetches the feed, and then I simply send it through a loop which does which loops through another pipe, which is a YouTube music video search, which is very similar to the YouTube video search that we looked at when we went over the introduction to Yahoo pipes. And then finally another loop which goes over another pipe I created, which is a lyric search. It is kind of a complex pipe, but it searches a website called AZ Lyrics and then extracts the lyrics part of the web page. So let's see. So I'm not going to spend ages explaining the inner workings of that pipe. I'm happy to answer questions later on it if you're really that interested. But essentially I found this website and I managed to figure out that all of its lyrics are constructed from a URL in a certain way. So it's essentially the URL and then the artist name and then the song name, stripped of any punctuation and spaces, and all in lowercase. And I managed to generate that from the title and artist names well enough to be able to get that. And then I simply, there's a module in pipes called this XPath fetch page here, where I simply just told it to extract this, where is it? Okay, there's a particular div here that contains all of the lyrics. So I told it to just extract that div from the page, and so that's what then gets injected into my pipe and finally output into my web page at the end. So that's what that lyrics search pipe actually does. And then using the loop module, it combines all of those so that my ultimate output looks like this. Okay, so I get initially the iTunes RSS feed, and then with each loop module, I'm simply adding extra data to it. So I add, when I get the YouTube search results, I add this music video object, okay, which contains a link somewhere here, a link to the YouTube video. And when I loop through my lyrics module, okay, it attaches that particular bit of HTML. Okay, so you'll notice if I look at the source here, it's actually extracted the HTML text from the page, so it's still got all of its paragraph and all its HTML tags in there as well. Okay, so I won't say any more on the pipe. As I said, I want to focus on actually getting the data out of the pipe, but if you have specific questions about that later on, I'm happy to try and attempt to explain them. Okay, so I've explained, again, just reminding you, I've explained that I've taken this bit of code here for the drop-down menu so that it's got the exact numbers representing the genres there, and I've just put that into my web page. Okay, so now I'll go about essentially rebuilding this web page step by step. So I'll create a new version of this. I'll call this index3.html. Okay, so far I've got a blank HTML page. I'll give it a title, uTunes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste the basic HTML structure here, because that's stuff that we've gone over a lot, so there's not a lot extra to explain there. Okay, so essentially all I've got is, in my body section, a container div. I've got a heading 1, and I've got this select option, or this select menu here. Okay, so that's the code that I just copied straight from that iTunes website. So it gives me the drop-down menu, and so it's got all these names in here, but the actual important thing which we will send to the pipe is this value here, okay? Because it recognizes it based on the numerical identification rather than the text string. Okay, and then I've got a empty content div, which is where I'm going to inject my HTML once I've got the data returned from the pipe, and then I've just got a footer which has a link to the pipe. So it's always nice to, when you do this, link back to the original source pipe, just so people can see how it works. Okay, so let's open this in a browser. Okay, so I'm going to have my console open because I'll use that a bit to debug my code here. And okay, the first thing I'm going to do, or the next thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to need some JavaScript, and I am going to use Jquery as part of this page. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, include the script tag for loading jQuery from Google servers. So we've done that before, that shouldn't necessarily be anything new. Okay, so I put the script tag in there, it links to jQuery hosted on Google's content developer network. Okay, and then I need my own custom scripts. Now, as I say in my blog post here, I have in this instance, just so I can paste it all out as one big bit of code, I've put all of my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the one file, but there's nothing to stop you from splitting those into separate files and most people will tell you that's good practice to do anyway. So so there's nothing I'm doing here that requires that you put everything in the one file, but I'm just going to do it because it's easier to jump back and forth for demonstration purposes. Okay, so I will now have my own custom script. The first thing I'm going to do is use the jQuery's document.ready function and put my code inside of here. As we learned last time, we do that so that the JavaScript doesn't get executed until all of the content on the web page is loaded. Okay, so what should we do next? Alright, what I'm going to do is, because let's just have a look at the complete example again. Basically, because I've got the option of selecting different genres, I'm going to want the ability to do a bunch of code a number of times. Each time I click on one of those options, I'm going to want it to repeat the process of going and fetching the data from Yahoo pipes and then outputting it. So that should scream at you that we need, unless we want to write the same code over and over again, we need some sort of a function. So I'm going to create a function here, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it fetch. Okay, and every time I call this function, I want it to go and fetch the data from the pipe, and I'm going to want to be able to specify a genre as well. Okay, so because the genre I need to be able to send to the pipe so it gives me back the results for that particular genre. Now, I need to know one really important thing about how to actually get the information from the pipe. And the first thing I need to know is how I tell my JavaScript where my pipe exists. And so if we have a look at the pipe itself, and we run the pipe, okay, I'll just run it with nothing in there. Just as an aside, if I run it with no genre here at all, it defaults to use all genres. Okay, so once you run a pipe in this view, you'll notice that there's a bunch of links down here, and you can. And these are all ways of accessing the data. A very simple way to get your information into a web page is actually to use this get-as-badge script here, or link here. If I click on this, it actually loads. There's an option here to embed, and I can simply copy this script, and I can embed this in my HTML page, and wherever I embed it, it will actually output this particular view. So let me actually see if that is going to work here. Okay, so you can see that's one really easy way of getting the data from your pipe into a web page. And there's nothing wrong with that if you're happy with the layout of that data, and you can actually specify here to get a, if it has the option here to view it as a map or an image gallery, you can actually specify the option to output it like that in your web page as well. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind if you want a really simple, or if these particular layouts actually suit what you want to do. That's a really easy way to get it in there. But for my purposes, I actually want a bit more flexibility. So what I want to do is actually read through the data myself and then output just the bits that I want in the exact way that I want. So what I'm going to do is, you'll notice there's an option here to get as an RSS feed. So a very common thing that people use Yahoo pipes for is actually just combine a bunch of data that they can then generate an RSS feed for that they can read in their own newsreader. And so you can use that to get to the link for your combined pipe data's RSS feed. The one I'm actually interested in for my purposes is this get as JSON link here. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's simply a data format that is quite easy to use and manipulate in JavaScript. So all I'm going to do is right click on this and copy the link address, and I'm going to use this in my JavaScript code to tell it where to actually access my data. So what I'm going to do is create a variable called URL and set that equal to that link that I just copied. So you notice that the URL looks like pipes.yahoo.com with a bunch of stuff, and then finally this pipes.run, and then we've got some options here. We've got _ID equals a big long ID, so that's the unique ID that identifies my pipe. And then I've got _render, which is another variable to tell Yahoo Pipes to do something, equals JSON. That's telling it the format that I want it in. If I wanted this in an RSS feed, it would be something like that. Okay, but in my case, I want the JSON format. Okay, so that's the URL that I need to identify my pipe and actually get the data from it. So now that I've got that, I actually need to write the code which actually goes and fetches the data from that URL. And so this is the part of our code which is the Ajax call. Okay, it requests some information from a server and it returns it without actually having to refresh the page. So the way that we do that is, well, there's a few ways that you can do it, but there's a particularly easy way to do it using Jquery, which is to simply use a function called this one here, $.getJSON. So $ being the jQuery object, and then .get JSON like that. Okay, so this is very similar to when we looked at setting up event handlers for responding to things like click events. In this case, this is an event handler, and we specify a function which will respond, which will be called when the data actually gets returned from the server. So this getJSON method takes two parameters. The first one is the URL because it needs to know where to get the data from, and the second one is a function which will execute when the data is actually returned. Okay, so, and then we put in a parameter here which will contain the actual data that is returned. Okay, so now the reason that we do that, incidentally, the reason that we put in a function like this is because when we're doing things like accessing data from a server, rather than just waiting and putting the resulting actions on the next lines of code, if we did that, what you'd find is that because we don't know how long it's going to take to get back from the server, it might take a millisecond, it might take 10 seconds, or it might never return. If we were to do it sequentially like that, then the browser would just hang while it's waiting for the data to return. So by doing this, what we're essentially saying is, okay, make the request for the data and then keep going on with whatever other execution you have to do. And then as soon as the data returns, then call this function. So that's called a asynchronous request. So that's just the reason that we write this. We write something called a callback function like this. But essentially, the important parts are this getJSON method, the fact that we send it the URL to the pipe, and then we create a function which deals with the return data from the pipe, which will be stored in this variable here. So the simplest thing to do to test if this actually works is to just output to our console using console.log, okay, and then the data variable. So we'll see what is actually contained within the return variable here. Okay, so I'll refresh this page now, and of course it's actually doing nothing because I haven't actually called this function. So what I'm going to need to do is, so I've defined my function, but it's not going to do anything until I actually call it. So what I can do here is just say fetch, okay, and then I can type in a number which represents one of the genres. So I can just take one, for example, let's say I go, we'll take blues, which is number 2, okay, and I'll say fetch 2. Alright, and we'll refresh that now, and let's see if it does anything. Okay, there we go. So it took a little while, but there's my result here. So this is just a message telling me that my request has finished loading. And here is the console.log for my data object. Okay, so I can see it contains a bunch of information. It contains a variable called count, which tells me how many objects there are. Then it has this other object called value, which has a bunch of other information about the pipe. And then it's got this variable called items, which is actually an array of the items that are returned by the pipe. So this array here is pretty much exactly identical to the information that you end up seeing in this output part here. Okay, and we can compare that by looking at the first one and comparing the data. Okay, so well, actually, yeah, no, this should be all right. Okay, so there it is. We can see that the name is the same. If we looked at the description, all of the links would all be the same. And the important thing to notice is that all of the way that it names these variables here, you'll recognize are identical to the way that the pipe names them as well. Okay, so if I want to get the name of the artist, there's a variable called im:artist, which has a variable inside of it called content, which has the name of the artist. Okay, and they're all going to be replicated. So that's really useful for actually debugging to make sure that your pipe data is matching what you're getting from the request, the get JSON request to the pipe itself. Okay, so this items array here is really the only part of this information that we're actually interested in. But it's contained within this object that contains a bunch of other stuff that we don't really care that much about. So what we need to know is actually how to access any of these items. So this object here, this top level object, represents our data variable that we've specified here. And then inside of that we've got an object called value, and then inside of that we've got an array called items. So if I want to specifically reference that items array, I can say, well, let's say I create a variable called items. Okay, and that's going to be equal to data dot, okay, and then this object here, value dot, and then this object here, which is an array, items. Okay, so hopefully you'll notice that this dot syntax here essentially means go inside of that object and look for something called this, and then go inside of that object and then look inside of something called this. Okay, so that's called object dot notation, and it's very common in lots of programming languages how you access objects, or how you access variables that are stored inside of objects. But just so that we don't have to write this over and over every time, okay, I've now stored that items array in this variable called items. Now, what we actually haven't done yet is, you'll notice even though I said fetch to, so fetch for a particular genre, this hasn't returned results for that genre. It's still returned just the default results with no genre, because I haven't actually included as part of the URL telling it what the genre is. So if I go back here and have another look at the front end of the pipe here, And if I actually put in a genre, so I put 2 there and I run the pipe, okay, there it is. Now I'm going to copy this link address again now that I've actually searched for a genre, and you should notice that it is slightly different. Okay, so you'll notice at the end I've got this end genre equals 2. So the way that we actually specify inputs for our pipe is to add them as parameters to the URL. Now, the way that we name this is very important, and it needs to be named whatever the name value of this input module is here. So that way, if I had a bunch of input modules, I can specify different values for different inputs. Okay, but that name there needs to match up with that name in the URL there. Okay. So basically what I need to do is I need to modify this URL, but I'm not going to assume that a genre is always set, because when the genre is not set, that's when it just gets me all the items. So what I'm going to do is add a conditional statement here and say, well, if genre, so if genre actually exists, if I've specified a genre, then with the URL, I'm going to say plus equals, which means add on to the end of it, genre equals, and then whatever the value of genre passed to this function was. Alright, and then just to test what that URL looks like, I'm going to do a console.log for the URL, so I can see what the exact URL that's going to be requested is. Okay, so, oops, let's see what's happening here. 22. Sorry, I got that around the wrong way. That should be plus equals instead of equals plus. Okay, so there is the URL that my pipe is outputting, and I can see now that genre 2 is appended to the end of it. And actually, if I click on that, this is the exact data that's being returned to my web page when I make that request. Okay, so that's another good way to test that it's actually kind of working. So now if I go and specify a different number, so let's say 5 for classical here when I'm calling my fetch function. So this URL now should specify and genre equals 5 when I refresh the page. Okay, and there it is. Okay, so now we have a way to tell it to access a particular genre, but at the moment we're having to hard code it into the code here as a number. What we really want to be able to do is detect when we're clicking on that drop down menu and then send it whatever value happens to be the value of that drop down menu here. Okay, so the way that we will do that is, first of all, we're going to use a Jquery Selector to select this particular select element here. So I've given it an ID of feed genre. So I can select that using Jquery using this syntax here. So $ and then hash for an ID, feed genre. Okay, that accesses the element itself, and then if I want to access its current value, so whichever one of these values is the currently selected one, then I can use this function .val. Okay, so, but actually even before I do that, what I need to do is set up an event listener so that any time the value of that drop-down menu is changed, then we can trigger a new fetch call to the pipe to get the data. So the way that I'm going to do that is, again, select the feed genre element, and then I'm going to add an event listener. Now I could do this with a click event, I suppose, if I want, but by using the change event, that actually covers any method of it changing. So if I was to manipulate it with the keyboard as well as the mouse, okay, if it changes in any way, that actually covers that. Okay, so this is, I set this up just like any of the other event handlers that we looked at previously, like the click event handler. And I simply just specify a function which will be triggered when that change event happens. So whenever that change event happens, I would like to essentially I want to call the fetch function from within this event handler. So I'm going to want to call fetch, and then whatever I send it here, I want to be the value of the current that this is currently selected to. And that I can access by using this. So I could put this whole thing down inside here, but just to make it a little bit more readable, I'll create another variable here, and I'll call this, let's just call this val equals, okay, so feed genre dot val. And then I can say fetch val. So now when this select menu is changed, whatever the value is that it's been changed to will be sent to this fetch function here. The fetch function will be called with that particular value. Okay, that will be tacked on to the end of this pipe URL, and then using this getJSON call with that URL, the appropriate data will be returned. And so we should now be able to see different data output when we actually select something. Okay, so let's have a look now. We'll refresh this. Okay, nothing's going to happen straight away because I haven't triggered the fetch function to be called until I actually change the value of this. So when I click this, okay, we can see now that it's okay, called the URL with the genre equals 2. Alright, I can cross-reference my code to make sure that's correct. There it is, value equals 2 for blues. Okay, and it's returned some objects, and if I was to go through and look at those, I'm fairly sure you'd find out they would be different for each of these different ones. Okay, so I can try another one. Go country, genre equals 6. Okay, it's doing its request. There it is, returns some more different items. Now I just want to double check that it actually works if I specify all genres. You'll notice all genres here has a value of nothing. Okay, so I just want to make sure that it actually works if I send it a value of nothing here, and it does. Okay, it gives me my items, that all appears to be correct. Okay, so we have now a method of specifying a particular parameter which we send to the pipe, and then actually getting the data returned from the pipe as well. Now all we really have left to do is to take that data and output it into the web page so that it looks like something useful. But actually one thing I will do before that is, as I said, at the moment when we load the page, it doesn't do anything. What I'd like it to do is do a request using all genres by default. And so what I'm going to do is simply have a single call to my fetch function, specifying the feed genre's current value. Okay, which by default will be all genres. Okay, and because that's not inside any of these other event handler functions, that will be executed straight away. So when I refresh the page now, okay, that should come back with the items array, the results for the top songs in all genres. Okay, so that's really all of the new stuff. The rest of it is just building upon what we did last time. We take some data and then we output it into the web page. So let's just say Okay, so where are we here? Okay, so I'm inside of this getJSON function callback. At the moment, all we're doing is outputting the data, and then we've created this variable called items. So what I can do is I've got this content section down here, okay, and it's empty, so I can use it to output some information into it. So let's just say do something easy to test first of all. First of all, I'm going to need to select that content div. Okay, so it's got an ID of content, so it looks like this. Okay, and then we go, and then I can use the dot, I can use dot append. Okay, and append will add whatever I put inside of here into that particular element there. So I can append, let's just say I want to get the first item's description. Okay, so item 0 and then the description element. Then I can simply say something like this, items, and then using bracket notation to reference the first one, say item 0. Excuse me. And then using my dot syntax, I can say description. Okay, now that should output the description for item 0 inside of my content div. Okay, and there it is. And I can change this to anything up to 9. Okay, and it should output the description there. So the description, you'll notice that the description variable here in the pipe actually contains some HTML, hence it's outputting like that. It's not a simple bit of text, it actually contains HTML. Now, it's not quite so useful to us yet because what I really want to do is output all of them. And so we've covered this before. If I have a list of items, then the way that I output all of those is I create some sort of a loop. So what I can do is create let's say we create a for loop here. So I can say for var I equals 0, and then I put my condition, keep looping while I is less than items.length, and then increment the value of I. Okay, and then instead of specifying a number here, I simply specify the variable I. So each time through the loop, it'll be 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, all the way until it gets up to the last number in the items array. So now when I run it, okay, it outputs all of the descriptions for each of those items. So now hopefully you can see that this is just a matter of building upon that. So inside of this loop, I simply extract more information out of the pipe and I inject it into the web page in a similar fashion. So now I'm going to modify this slightly because rather than keeping on appending things, what I'm going to do is create a variable here which is going to store the HTML that I will eventually inject into the web page. And I'll start it off with an empty string, and I'm just going to keep building it up like this by using plus equals. Because I don't just want to output the information, I also want to output some HTML tags as well. So in the final product here, if we inspect the HTML, you'll notice that I've got, so there's my content div there, and then inside of each of these I have a div with a class of item, okay, and then I have also a div with a class of YouTube for the YouTube channel, a div with a class of description, and then a div with a class of lyrics to hold the lyrics. So I do actually want to inject some HTML divs in there as well. So I can do that by essentially just writing out the HTML inside of the string. So I can go div class equals item. Okay, and I'm just building up this string with the information that I want to inject inside of it. So inside of that, I want to have another div with class of, what did we have here? Okay, YouTube. And then I'll close off that div. So I'm just really creating my HTML structure here. And then I'll create one for the description. And finally one for the lyrics. And I also had a heading here for the lyrics heading. Okay, and that initially says show lyrics with a plus. Okay, so now inside of my description div, I'm going to want to output my items i.description. Okay, and so essentially rather than writing all of this out inside of here, just keep it a bit nicer, I've created this string variable here, and this plus equals, as we've seen before, just simply adds on to the end. So what I'm really doing is building up a bit of HTML, which is a combination of HTML that I've written, and then also, where it's appropriate, bits of information that I'm pulling out of the pipe itself. And then finally, when I append this, I just have to append that HTML variable that I've created there. It will output all of that into the web page. What have I got here? Did something wrong. That should be there. Okay, so assuming I've done that correctly, sorry, it should be items. Okay, there we go. So it doesn't look a huge amount of difference, but if we look in the HTML, in the content, now I can see these are nicely contained within an item div, and there's a YouTube div, which at the moment is empty, but there's a description div, and there's a lyrics heading, and then there's a lyrics div, which is also empty. So all I really have to do is add the other parts to this. So let's do the lyrics next, because they're fairly easy to output. And again, if I look at my items in here, I can see the lyrics. I've stored them in a variable called lyrics. Okay, so to access those, I just go items and then the number and then lyrics. So inside of my lyrics div here, we go items I dot lyrics. Okay, now, and if I wanted to save myself even a little bit more typing, rather than having to write items I each time, I could just create a new variable called item, singular, and say that's equal to items I at that point through the loop. Okay, and then rather than specifying items I each time, I could just say items. Sorry, I could just say item. So item.description and item.lyrics. Okay, so now we'll just test that. We should be able to see the lyrics output as well. Okay, there it is. There's the lyrics for each of the songs. Okay, so you can see why in the final version I chose to have them collapsible, because they take up quite a lot of space, and if I don't want to look at them, it's a bit of unnecessary scrolling. Okay, now the only slightly tricky part about this now is actually getting the information out of the pipe that's required to embed a YouTube video. Now, the easiest way to explain this is to look at, okay, so I've got my item here called music video, and inside of here I've got a variable called link, which if I copy and paste that, I get the YouTube video. Now, the way that you embed a YouTube video, or the standard way, is you click on the share button, you click embed, and it gives you a bit of code here. Okay, so if I want to embed any YouTube video, all I really have to do is essentially copy and paste this bit of code. But the important thing is, the thing that's going to change depending on the video is going to be this identification string here. Okay, that bunch of characters there. And you'll notice that it is the exact same bunch of characters that are up here in the URL. Now, unfortunately, as part of my pipe, it doesn't return me that ID as a nice, neat, just set of characters by itself. So what I actually have to do is extract that from the URL. But I can use the fact that these particular string of characters is always 11 characters long, and it always starts on the 31st character of the URL. So if I know that, and I do know that for a fact, if you look at any video, it's always going to be this URL /watch $v equals, and then a string of 11 characters and something else. If I know that, then as long as I have the URL to the video, then I can extract that unique ID and then embed that into the HTML for the embed code here. So I won't type that out line by line just to save a bit of time, but that is exactly what I've done right here. Okay, so as this comment says, it extracts the YouTube, as typo, it extracts the YouTube video ID of the music video from its URL. So I'm getting the item.music video, sorry, so first of all I'm checking that a music video actually exists. I probably don't strictly have to do that, but if you couldn't find one, I suppose that it makes sense to check for that. But the important part is this here. I'm creating a variable called YouTube ID, which, and in fact, I'll get rid of this just because I think it makes it a bit more confusing. don't need that there. I'm just creating this variable. Okay, creating this variable YouTube ID, and I'm referencing the item.musicvideo.link object, okay, which is here. Okay, there's my item, there's my music video object, and there's my link. Okay, so essentially this bit of data is the URL to the YouTube video. And then I'm calling this JavaScript function substr, which is shorthand for substring. And if you Google this or look up the documentation on it, it will tell you that it takes two parameters. The first one is, so what a substring does is essentially extracts one smaller part of a string from a larger string. And in this case, I'm telling it start at the 31st character of this URL and get me the 11 characters on from there. Okay, and if I output this, just to check, console.log YouTube ID like this, then I should be able to check that it is in fact the correct information. Okay, so I should get 10 of these, one for each item. Okay, there it is. So there's the YouTube ID for item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so all I really need to do now is for each one of these items take that YouTube ID and output it in the web page along with the standard embed code for a YouTube video. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste all of that, except for this part I'm going to inject the YouTube ID for the video rather than hard coding that ID there. So again, I'll just copy and paste this from the completed example. Okay, and so I'm going to do it in between the start and end of my YouTube div here. Okay, and there it is there. I've got it all on one line, but you can I'll get rid of that. Don't need to duplicate that, and I don't need to duplicate that. Okay, I've got this all on one line, but that is the exact YouTube embed code that you would copy and paste from here. The only difference is where it comes to, you can see the end of this URL here, so source equals blah 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 there. Up to here, as soon as it gets to embed /, okay, then I'm inserting this YouTube ID variable there. Okay, so it outputs all that code with the ID of whatever the music video happens to be for that object. Okay, and then I've set its width and height to be a number which I know happens to fit nicely for this layout. Okay, so let's try and test that. Okay, and there it is. So there's our YouTube video which has been output, there's our description, and there's our lyrics. So that is actually all of our content output, and we should be able to test that it works with others as well. And by testing that, I can see that there's something that I've done here which, well, there's something that I haven't actually done yet. It might have been a bit hard to see, but what you'll notice is that when I selected another genre, it's actually outputted the new results at the bottom of everything that was already there. Because I keep calling append, it's just adding it onto the bottom of that content div. So what I actually need to do is every time I call the fetch function, I first need to clear the contents of that content div. So I can do that by saying selecting it first of all. So selecting the content div, and then setting the HTML to be an empty string. Okay, so just inverted commas with nothing in there. Alright, and that will replace whatever is inside the content div with an empty string, nothing. So now, when I select another genre, okay, you'll notice that it clears it first of all, and then when the data is returned, it should populate it with, okay, the new information. Now, what's also good practice here is you'll notice that it does take a little while for it to show up. So it's always good if people have to wait to see something happen, is to show them a message that something is actually working or thinking, and it's not it's not actually broken. So what I'm going to do here is, rather than replace this with empty text, I'm going to just put a little loading message here. Okay, so now when I select something, okay, it at least tells me that it's loading while it actually loads the data. Okay, because it can take a little while. Now, obviously, I'm going to want to get rid of that as soon as the data is actually loaded. So when the data is loaded here, I will actually replace the content div with an empty string, just so it's all cleared out before I actually start adding the song information. Okay, so it's loading. As soon as it loads, this should disappear, and then it should output the information. Come on. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so now I've got all the content here. I think it might be time to add some of my styles in. So again, this is something we've gone over tons of times, so I'm simply going to copy and paste these styles because there's nothing really new to see in here. Again, as I said, I'm putting these all in the one file, but there's nothing to stop you from putting these in an external CSS file. So these are the styles for my page here now. Okay, so this looks something more like that. Okay, so it's laid out a bit more nicely. I've got the details aligned to the left, the YouTube video aligned to the right. The lyrics are now hidden by default. Okay, I've got a style which tells my lyrics div with a class of .lyrics to display none. Because what I'm going to do is use JavaScript to only display them when I click on the lyrics heading. But the other thing I need to do is what I'm not doing is applying the background. So you'll notice in the completed example that I have an alternating color background here. Okay, so now actually this is something you could apply purely using CSS now, but when I first did this example it wasn't very well supported. So I did it using JavaScript, and I'll show you how to do it using JavaScript anyway, because it's just, I don't know, something interesting to learn in JavaScript. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a different class. So I've got classes down here, even row and odd row, with different background colors, and I'm going to apply those to odd numbered or even numbered item divs when they're output. So I need this to be inside of my getJSON callback function, but after the end of my loop. So once all of these item divs are output, once all of these item divs are output, what I'm going to do is I'll just copy and paste this. Okay, these two lines of code essentially do that. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting inside of the content ID, inside the content div, any element, which are my divs with a class of item, and I can use these pseudo selectors when I'm using jQuery selectors. Okay, so I can say even items or odd items, and so the even items I add a class of even row, and the odd items I add a class of odd row, and so they will get those different background colors assigned to them. Okay, and there they are. Okay, so this is looking a lot more like a completed product, but there's still a couple more things that we have to do. Now this is interesting here actually. Now, okay, you'll notice here this particular time that it's returned the data. I've gotten this value of null for my music video. Now that's telling me that there's actually a problem in the pipe, and it stopped my my page from actually functioning. So thinking back, that is probably actually why I added that conditional statement in for testing whether the music video existed. And so that's why you'll see that in the final example. But this might actually be useful to point out something else I have in the final example. Is there is a slight problem with Yahoo pipes, and it's due to something called caching, and it's both beneficial, but it can be a problem as well. So you may have noticed before when I was selecting some of these, if they were ones I'd selected before, they actually showed up a lot quicker than ones that I hadn't selected before. And that's because Yahoo pipes will do something called caching, which means if you've requested the same data not that long ago, let's say within the last hour, then it will just send you back the same results without actually going and doing all of its searches again. And that saves bandwidth, and it also makes it a bit faster. The problem with that can be, though, if there's an error in the pipe, like there has just been now, where it hasn't shown the music video, then it will cache that error, and for the next hour it will not send you music video. So this will probably not work again, I imagine. Yeah, okay, so I'm getting the same error. Now, there is a way that you can force Yahoo pipes not to cache its data. And again, you will see this in the completed example, and it's worthwhile explaining why it's there. So in my completed example, you'll notice at the end of my URL here, I actually additionally have added my own variable here, which is not necessarily sending any useful data to the pipe. But I've added a timestamp variable which is outputting a time value. And this time value is a unique value. And this is a very common method of preventing caching when you're requesting information from a server, because the way caching works is it will see if you've requested the same URL before, and if you have, it will just send you back the data that it's cached. Now, if I add this time variable to the end, it's a very specific time variable. It's down to the millisecond. So if that time variable is different every time I submit that, then it's going to think I'm requesting a different URL, and it's going to send me the non-cached data. So that should force it to refresh all of its sources. So that's one way of actually getting around that problem with Yahoo pipes. So I might just copy and paste this code to quickly put it into this example here. Let's see. So I'm simply creating a date object and then generating a timestamp, a current timestamp using date.getTime. And then I'm going to add the URL here and timestamp. And this timestamp name here can be whatever you want. I'm just making this name up. Last time. Now, hopefully, if I do this and I refresh the page, it will force the pipe to send me non-cache data, and I should have a better chance of the YouTube video working again. Okay, so it's kind of obscure, and don't worry too much about that, but if you run into that trouble, just know there is a way around it, and I can help you out with that if you want. Okay, the last thing to do is get this lyrics showing and hiding to work. So the way that we do that is, I think we covered this. I think we covered this or something similar to it last tutorial. But it looks a bit like this. Okay, so again, I want to apply this code every time the data is refreshed and injected into the page. So I'm making sure it's inside of this getJSON callback function. But this is the code which handles the click handler functions on the lyrics headings. Okay, so I've output the lyrics headings as part of this code, which I've appended to content here. And then once that's output, I need to make sure I do it after it's output so that I can access it with the selectors here. I select the lyrics heading, and then I add a click event handler to it with a callback function here. And inside of that callback function, first of all, I'm creating a variable to store a reference to the lyrics heading, so I don't have to keep writing this out here, and I can do that simply by using $this. That's just shorthand of writing that all out again. And then I'm also creating a variable to store its parent item, and I can use that using the lyrics heading and then using a function called closest, which essentially takes an object. So if I'm looking at the lyrics heading, it takes an object and then it searches up the HTML tree for the closest element with matching this selector here, so the class of item. So that's probably easy to explain if we actually look at the tree, the document tree. So I've got my lyrics heading here. Okay, so that's what I'm initially selecting, my lyrics heading, and then I'm saying with lyrics heading, select the closest. So closest is a jQuery function. If you look up the documentation, it says it looks up the HTML tree for the nearest parent item, which has a selector matching this. So it will start with the heading 3, and then it will go up a level. Okay, and it will find this div here, which has a class of item, and it will return that element. Okay, and then once I have the parent item, I'm doing this all because I need to be able to find the current div with the class of lyrics, which actually contains my lyrics, because that's what I want to be able to hide or show. So finally, to do that, to find my lyrics div, okay, I take this parent item, and then I use the find function, which, if you look up the jQuery help, does the exact opposite of closest. So as closest looks up the HTML tree, find looks down the HTML tree and looks for the closest child object, which has the selector matching this, in this case, the class of lyrics. So it will get this. Okay, so we started off by selecting the heading, searching up for an element with a class of item, and then searching down for a class of lyrics. okay, which is here, which contains all of my lyrics. And then with that, depending on whether it's already hidden or not, I want to toggle its visibility. So I select the lyrics div and I say if the lyrics div is currently hidden, so this again is another jQuery object function to test whether an element is hidden. So if the lyrics div is hidden, then show the lyrics div and change the lyrics heading text to be hide lyrics with a minus sign. Otherwise, if the lyrics div is not hidden, then I'm assuming there's only two values for it, it's going to be hidden or not hidden, then if it's visible, hide the lyrics div and set the lyrics heading text to be show lyrics with a plus sign. Okay, so once all that's in there, we should now be able to click on this and it will expand the lyrics, and when we click on it again we can hide the lyrics and it will work for each of these. Okay, and we can test that all of the other selections work. Okay, so the idea of this mashup then is that you get all of the most popular songs based on what's selling. And I think I've got a small error here. I don't think it's applying this properly. Where are we here? Okay, so I'm still getting YouTube errors, so I might still just put that conditional code back in. Oh, I should actually explain in the final example. In my final example, I've written this loop slightly differently. I should explain that. Now let's copy and paste that in here. So my final example, you'll see rather than using a for loop, I've used this $.each function. That's a jQuery function which is essentially just another way of doing a loop. I guess it's slightly more efficient because it gives me the item variable straight away, but not a great deal. Probably when I was originally creating this example, I just did it to try that out or to demonstrate something else in jQuery. But there's really, functionally, there's no difference from doing this and using a for loop. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry at all about that. You could just as easily and correctly write that as a for loop. So it's being a bit sketchy with loading some of the videos, but because I got the conditional statements in there, at least it doesn't break when it can't get the videos. So ultimately, the idea behind this mashup would be you get the most popular songs based on sales in one interface. You can, through the description here, get links to information about the album and purchase it if you want in iTunes. Information about the artist or the album very quickly. You can play it if it allows embedding. This one obviously doesn't, so that's probably not a great example. This one might. So maybe if I refresh we can get one that will. Well, the Daft Punk one works, but will actually load. Yes, there we go. Okay. Okay, so the idea being you quickly come through, download on this one, look at the lyrics. Okay, move on to the next one. Okay, a lot of these obviously are not allowing me to play them embedded. So probably if I wanted to, I could go back and modify my YouTube search pipe to actually only return me results that do allow embedding, if that's possible. I'm not sure, but that's probably one thing I'd go back and do to enhance this. But that's pretty much it, the in and out of it. So what we've learnt today, we've built upon our understanding of using Yahoo pipes to create mashups, and we've built upon the introduction to JavaScript stuff that we did last tutorial. We've combined those two things to be able to access data from a pipe, access live data, mashup feed. Now you could use this with your own pipes. You could just as easily use this with anyone else's pipes that they've published. So, and you're more than welcome to do that if someone's already got a pipe that has information that's useful for your prototype. You can do that as well if you want. And we've looked at how to extract that information, and then using our existing knowledge of JavaScript and jQuery, how to use that and inject it into a web page. And using Ajax so that we get sort of more application-like behavior, I guess you could say. It doesn't have to reload the whole page to reload the content. Okay, so that's probably a good place to finish there, I think. Are there any questions anyone has about anything I did in this example? I will, as usual, upload the screencast and the example code. Actually, the example code's already up there, so you can have a look at that. The final example, I've tried to comment it really well to explain exactly what I'm doing at each step along the way. And so you should actually be able to copy and paste a lot of this code and get it working in your own examples with a different pipe. That might be a good way to experiment with this. Using your own pipe or a different pipe. Just take this example and modify it and try and modify the parts that are relevant to actually extracting the data from the pipe and then outputting them into the web page. Okay, so I'll finish up there.